Now that I've explained the delays, let me finally explain what this presentation and issue is really about. After Srila Prabhupada departed from this world, the GBC told us that Srila Prabhupada had named 11 men as his successor gurus. It must be noted that the GBC had reached their understanding that Srila Prabhupada was going to select some men who would become actual gurus and his successors back in May of 1977 at the last official GBC meeting held with Srila Prabhupada. Yet they chose not to share this all-important information with the rank-and-file members and disciples of Srila Prabhupada until months after Srila Prabhupada had physically departed. The list where Srila Prabhupada had given the names of the 11 men was written on July 9th, 1977. Yet the rank-and-file members had no knowledge of it until, again, months after Srila Prabhupada's disappearance. And even then, all we were told was that His Divine Grace had written a list, given the 11 names of the new acharyas. The GBC did not provide copies of this list to anyone else to see, to verify for ourselves that this is really what Srila Prabhupada had instructed. The only information they give us, the only evidence they shared, were their own words, what they told us. There was nothing more. At the time, this list was just referred to as the list. The fact that the GBC had withheld such all-important information that so deeply concerned all of us, and then just sprung it on us well after Srila Prabhupada was no longer present, was very disturbing to many. Such behavior on their part made a lot of devotees suspicious about the whole matter. Some became convinced that Srila Prabhupada could not have selected those men as his successors, but those who spoke up and openly voiced their opinions were dealt with harshly and immediately kicked out of ISKCON. It very quickly became clear, either keep our mouths shut and accept what the GBC told us, or at least appear to accept what the GBC told us, or get thrown out. The vast majority of ISKCON members just wanted to be good devotees in good standing. Therefore, most of us, seeing no other acceptable alternative, felt we had no choice but to just go along. A godbrother of mine very nicely expressed the feeling that many of us shared at the time. He said that while we all knew what the GBC was telling us was all wrong, at the same time, none of us had a clue what was right. The problem was that for many years, the rank-and-file members had no access at all to any evidence, such as the list, as it was then called, or the transcripts of the meeting in May. We had absolutely no way of knowing if what the GBC was telling us was really what Srila Prabhupada truly wanted or not. Although we knew in our hearts that the GBC was on the wrong path, we had absolutely no clue at all at that time what the right path was. Then, in 1985, this was 8 years after Srila Prabhupada wrote the July 9th letter. In 1985, a devotee, Sulochan, wanted to do his own research on the topic and asked a devotee at the BBT to sneak out a copy of Srila Prabhupada's letters and important transcripts. At that time, the BBT had copied Srila Prabhupada's letters and important papers onto microfilm as a way of preserving them. Note that I said he asked his friend to sneak out a copy of Srila Prabhupada's letters. And I will explain in the main presentation, after Srila Prabhupada departed, the GBC had actually formally banned Srila Prabhupada's letters. They had banned devotees' access to all his letters at that time. So the copies had to be taken out of the BBT archives against GBC permission. This was 8 years after Srila Prabhupada wrote the list, as it was called back then, and for the first time, a rank-and-file devotee of Srila Prabhupada was able to read this list for himself, and for the first time, a rank-and-file member was able to read what Srila Prabhupada had actually instructed on this matter, and not just be told by the GBC what they said he had instructed. he saw that this list was actually written in the form of a letter, which was addressed to both the GBC and to the temple presidents. Right off the top, he knew this didn't look well for the GBC. Since it was addressed to the temple presidents, why hadn't the temple presidents received a copy of it at the time? Why didn't the GBC share such an all-important document as this with all of us, and instead chose to keep it hidden to themselves? Right off the top, he knew things were not at all right. But the most alarming thing he saw were the instructions Srila Prabhupada gave in this list, which devotees soon after that began to start referring to as the July 9th letter. Yes, there was a list of the names of the same 11 men as the GBC had told us, but in this letter, Srila Prabhupada only authorized these men to act as his Rtvik representatives. Explicitly, the process given was that these men were to conduct the ceremonies of the initiations on behalf of Srila Prabhupada, who would remain the actual initiating guru. Unlike what the GBC told us, there was no mention in the letter where Srila Prabhupada instructed these men were to ever become regular gurus. This was a shocking revelation. We can see that because of GBC's action to have kept the contents of this letter secret, to have kept it away from all the other devotees when it was actually addressed to the temples, it is fully understandable how the early supporters of the Rtvik system had jumped to the worst conclusions. This devotee started making copies of this letter and passed it around to other Prabhupada disciples. The first thoughts by many were, no wonder the GBC were keeping this letter hidden to themselves. No wonder they didn't want us to see it. Srila Prabhupada never authorized them to become gurus. And thus many jumped to the conclusion that the GBC had actually been lying to us all this time. The fact that many of us knew that these men were just not qualified at the time wasn't due to our being envious, as the GBC most often claimed. The fact is, we understood our philosophy well enough to identify those who are still materially conditioned souls, who still possess many mundane desires. It has nothing to do with enviousness. In the main presentation, I include a conversation between Srila Prabhupada and Tamal Krishna that was recorded on April 22nd, 1977, just 2.5 short months before this July 9th letter was written. In that conversation, Tamal Krishna tells Srila Prabhupada that he has studied himself and all of Prabhupada's disciples, and he said he knows that we're all conditioned souls and that none of us were qualified at that time to become guru. And Srila Prabhupada agreed with that assessment. That was just 2.5 months before writing this July 9th letter. So for many of us, to have at that time also assessed that none of these men were really qualified to become gurus was not based on our envy any more than Tamal's own assessment was, or Srila Prabhupada's assessment. But those who spoke up at that time and spoke out, their honest assessment, were kicked out of Srila Prabhupada's mission. The GBC viewed such assessments as being envious and offensive and would not tolerate such behavior. When devotees first got access to the July 9th letter, many had lashed out at the GBC and the new gurus, proclaiming them all liars and cheaters. By that time, several of the gurus had fallen. The mad machine gun Hang Sadhu, the very high priest of LSD, Jayatirtha. Soon, Kirtanananda would be facing serious criminal charges. He was eventually found guilty of racketeering, mail fraud, child molestation, and criminal intent to commit murder. It was the natural response when subordinates find out that their leaders have kept such important information as this away from them. And then you see that the information they kept from you actually didn't say what they had been saying it said. Then a number of these leaders are falling down left and right for serious reasons, it's quite natural to jump to the worst possible conclusion and assume that all the gurus and the whole GBC was totally corrupt and they were part of a conspiracy to lie to us and to have taken Prabhupada's mission away from him. At least that's what a number of devotees jumped to conclude. Others were convinced the GBC, however, had made a mistake and were just wrong about what Srila Prabhupada actually wanted. I will go on into all of this in detail in the main presentation, but here, and this is the introduction, I just wanted to give some of the basics as to what this presentation is about. But one of the problems has been that the GBC in 1977 did keep this information from us. And as I said, even when they told us that Srila Prabhupada had given a list of the 11 men, they didn't even show us that list, which was the July 9th letter. It took 8 years before just a few devotees began to even start getting access to that letter. And for many like myself, for me, it was 1996 before I actually read the July 9th letter for the very first time. That's 19 years after Srila Prabhupada had written it. And not because the GBC weren't passing this letter out. Even 19 years later, it was being passed out by the Rtvik devotees, the devotees who supported the Rtvik side. And so even 19 years later, the GBCs were still not following Prabhupada's instruction. What he wanted was for this letter to be mailed to all the temple presidents. Well, I will go into this in detail in the main presentation. Here in the introduction, I want to introduce you to why the fact that the GBC kept this letter from us is of great significance in grasping a real good understanding of the overall topic. Why had they kept it from us at that time? It was written in the form of a letter on Srila Prabhupada's official letterhead. It is addressed to the GBC and the temple presidents, and it was Srila Prabhupada's desire and his request that this letter be sent to all the temples. The temple presidents would have, most certainly, and I've spoke to some, shared this with the devotees at their temples at that time. This was Srila Prabhupada's intent for having it addressed to the temple presidents. Then why was it not mailed out? Because when the GBC held their first meeting with Srila Prabhupada, their final meeting, their last meeting, official meeting with Srila Prabhupada on May 28th of 1977, he had also spoke on this topic. At that time, the GBC members had asked Srila Prabhupada how are initiations to be conducted in the future, particularly when you are no longer present. Fortunately, this most important conversation was recorded, and today we have both the transcripts of that recording as well as the actual recording itself, which we will present on the main presentation. It is also to be noted that in that last official GBC meeting with Srila Prabhupada was severely ill and weak at the time. He was mostly confined to his bed. Therefore, the meeting was held in his room in Vrindavan, but rather than the entire assembly of the GBC cramming into his room, the GBC sent a delegation of only 7 men. The GBC had prepared a list of questions addressing a number of issues that they wanted Srila Prabhupada's final guidance on before he departs. For the most part, only 2 of the GBC members were engaged in conversing with Srila Prabhupada in the meeting, Satsvarup Prabhu and Tamal Krishna Maharaj. One such topic was the question of initiations after he departs. Satsvarup read off the questions and Srila Prabhupada replied. After the meeting was over, then one of the members in that meeting, which I think it was Satsvarup, wrote down a summary of what he remembered and what he thought Srila Prabhupada's answers were. This devotee, be it Satsvarup or Tamal or one of the other of the 7 members who were present, wrote this from memory. And what they wrote did not contain any actual quote of what Srila Prabhupada had actually said. It was only a summary of what they could remember and what they thought he had said. This written summary by that GBC member became the official GBC record for what The whole rest of the GBC thought was Srila Prabhupada's reply to how initiations would be conducted after he departs. As I said, it would be many years before a transcript was made of that meeting, of the recording. In the main presentation, I will show you the handwritten notes that this person wrote, which became the only GBC record of that May 20, 1977 meeting of what the GBC members, what the whole mass of the majority of the GBC members thought was Srila Prabhupada's instructions regarding this issue. And I contrast that handwritten note with what Srila Prabhupada had actually said. You will see that the GBC record was totally lacking, it was completely wrong, and it was miserably misleading. It did not even closely resemble what Srila Prabhupada actually said. All the GBC record said, in short, was that when asked about initiations in the future after he departs, Srila Prabhupada said he would soon select some men and they will become regular gurus and initiate their own disciples. That is all it stated. And that was totally misleading, as this was not at all what His Divine Grace had actually said. It did not convey the most important things he had said,